Most people think of the Kennedy compound as a sunlit sanctuary on the edge of Cape Cod, a place where America's golden family escaped the world. But behind those white shingles and wind-beaten porches, the estate became something else entirely, a stage where 7 lives ended and a dynasty watched its dreams fracture. Here, in these quiet rooms, presidents prepared for battles they would never return from, children vanished into the tide, and a family bound by power discovered how fragile power truly is. Tonight, we step inside the house that carried their legacy and their curse. The story begins not with tragedy, but with a dream. In the summer of 1928, Joseph Patrick Kennedy Sr. stood on a bluff overlooking Nantucket Sound. He was 40 years old. His fortune was already vast, made through banking, bootlegging, and the kind of calculated risk that separates the wealthy from the merely comfortable. But money alone never satisfied Joe Kennedy. He wanted something more permanent, something that would outlast him. He wanted a dynasty. The property he purchased that year sat at the end of Marchant Avenue in Hyannisport, Massachusetts. 6 acres of windswept coastline, a white clapboard house with 15 rooms, views that stretched to the horizon. It cost $25,000, roughly $400,000 in today's currency. For most Americans still reeling from the economic uncertainty of the 1920s, it would have been unthinkable. For Joe Kennedy, it was a strategic investment. He didn't buy the house for vacations, he bought it to build something. The Cape Cod of 1928 was not yet the summer playground of presidents and celebrities. It was a working coastline of fishing villages and modest cottages. But Joe saw potential. The Massachusetts elite were beginning to discover these shores. The climate was temperate. The sailing was exceptional, and perhaps most importantly, it was close enough to Boston and New York to maintain his business empire while appearing to retreat from it. This would be where he forged his children into something extraordinary. Joe and his wife Rose already had 7 children by the time they arrived at Hyannisport. Joseph Jr., the eldest, was 13. John, called Jack, was 11. Rosemary was 10. Kathleen, called Kick, was 8. Eunice was 7. Patricia was 4. Robert was barely 3. 2 more would follow, Jean in 1928 and Edward, Ted, in 1932. 9 children in total, 9 potential heirs to whatever empire Joe could construct. The first summers at the compound established patterns that would define the family for generations. Joe ran the household like a military academy. Every child had a scheduled activity. Sailing lessons began at dawn. Competitive games filled the afternoons. Touch football on the lawn became a daily ritual, with Joe keeping score and demanding excellence. He timed their swimming. He judged their diving. He pitted them against each other in races that mattered far, more than any child's game should. "We want winners," Joe told them repeatedly. "We don't want any losers around here." Rose managed the interior machinery of the household with equal precision. A devout Catholic, she insisted on daily prayers. She maintained strict discipline. Meals occurred at exact times. Bedtimes were non-negotiable. She kept index cards for each child, tracking their medical appointments, vaccinations, and developmental milestones. Her devotion to order was absolute, but beneath her careful control lay something else, a determination to present perfection to the outside world, no matter what occurred behind closed doors. The children learned quickly what was expected. Joseph Jr., the designated heir, carried the weight of his father's ambitions on his shoulders from the earliest age. He was handsome, athletic, naturally confident. Joe Sr. groomed him relentlessly for political greatness. Young Joe absorbed it all, determined to fulfill every expectation. Jack, the second son, existed in his brother's shadow. Sickly from childhood, he suffered from mysterious ailments that would plague him throughout his life. Scarlet fever, chronic back pain, digestive problems that left him dangerously thin. He spent long stretches in bed while his siblings competed on the lawn. Yet he developed something his older brother lacked: a quiet charisma, a self-deprecating wit, an ability to make people lean in to hear what he would say next. The girls faced different pressures. They were expected to be accomplished but not ambitious, charming but obedient, beautiful ornaments to the family's rising prestige. Only Rosemary struggled openly with the family's demands. Born with intellectual disabilities that the family tried desperately to hide, she could not keep pace with her siblings. Her developmental delays embarrassed Joe, In family photographs, she smiled brightly, but privately Joe began searching for solutions to what he saw as a problem. By the mid-1930s, the compound had expanded dramatically. Joe purchased a second house next door for his growing family, then a third property for guests and staff. The three white houses formed a private enclave, connected by manicured lawns that swept down to the beach. The main residence grew to 28 rooms, a tennis court appeared. A private dock extended into the Sound. The compound became a kingdom unto itself. Summers transformed into carefully choreographed productions. The Kennedy children sailed matching boats. They won local regattas. Photographers captured them laughing on the beach, their teeth white, their hair windblown, their futures luminous. The press began to notice this remarkable family. So many talented children, so much vitality, so much promise. Joe orchestrated every detail. He understood something fundamental about American culture. Appearance creates reality. If people believed the Kennedys were exceptional, they would become exceptional. The compound served as the stage for this performance, but stages require labour to maintain. By 1935, the compound employed a full-time staff of 12. Cooks prepared elaborate meals. Groundskeepers maintained the lawns. A sailing instructor trained the children. Security personnel patrolled the property. The annual operating costs exceeded what most American families earned in a decade. None of this appeared in the photographs. By the late 1930s, Joe's political ambitions reached their apex. President Franklin Roosevelt appointed him ambassador to the Court of St. James, the American ambassador to Great Britain. It was one of the most prestigious diplomatic posts in the world. Joe moved his family to London, but the compound remained their true home. They returned every summer, and each return felt like a coronation. Joe's dreams seemed unstoppable. He envisioned a future where his sons would dominate American politics for generations. Joseph Jr. would become president. Perhaps Jack would serve in the Senate. Bobby might become Attorney General. The family's Catholic faith, once a liability in Protestant America, would be overcome through sheer force of achievement. The compound stood as physical proof that this dream could be real. On summer evenings, Joe would sit on the porch overlooking the Sound, a drink in his hand, watching his children play on the beach. 9 healthy, gifted children. 3 beautiful properties, a fortune still growing. Political connections that reached the highest levels of power. Everything he had built, everything he had schemed and fought and clawed to achieve, was finally taking shape. He had constructed his dynasty. The compound was its throne. But dynasties, like houses, require constant maintenance, and some cracks are invisible until the structure begins to collapse. What the photographers never captured were the rooms where the family's private struggles unfolded. Joe Kennedy's vision for his children wasn't inspiration. It was pressure. A pressure so intense it warped everything it touched. Each child grew up understanding that their worth derived not from who they were, but from what they could achieve. Love became conditional, approval had to be earned, and failure was unforgivable. Joseph Jr. felt this most acutely. As the eldest son, he carried the full weight of his father's expectations. Joe Sr. made it explicit. Young Joe would be president. Not maybe, not someday if things worked out. Would be. The path was laid out before him with mechanical precision. Harvard, law school, military service to build character, then politics. The family's entire future rested on his shoulders. Young Joe accepted this burden without complaint. He was, by all accounts, everything his father wanted. Confident, competitive, physically imposing. He excelled at Harvard. He argued politics with intellectual ferocity. He pushed himself harder than anyone else, as if trying to prove he deserved the crown that had been placed on his head before he could walk. But the cost of being the chosen one was isolation. Young Joe couldn't afford weaknesses, couldn't admit doubts, couldn't be anything less than the perfect heir. His siblings watched him struggle under this weight and learned their own lessons about what the family demanded. Jack, meanwhile, occupied a strange position. He was being groomed as the spare, important, but always secondary. This gave him a peculiar freedom. With less pressure came more room to develop his own identity. He read voraciously. He developed a biting sense of humour. He charmed everyone he met without appearing to try. But Jack's body betrayed him constantly. The back pain that began in childhood intensified through his teenage years. He concealed the extent of his suffering from almost everyone, including his parents. To admit weakness in the Kennedy household was to lose standing. So Jack smiled through the pain, took whatever medications doctors prescribed, and never let anyone see him falter. The upstairs bedroom where he spent sick days became a kind of sanctuary, the only place he could drop the performance. Rose Kennedy maintained her own performance with religious devotion. She attended Mass daily. She oversaw the children's education. She ensured the household ran with military precision. But beneath her composed exterior she was crumbling. 9 children in 17 years had taken their toll. She suffered from what we would now recognize as depression and anxiety. She took extended trips away from the family, sometimes for weeks, leaving the children in the care of staff. These absences were never discussed. In the Kennedy mythology, Rose was the perfect Catholic mother. The reality, that she sometimes couldn't bear to be in the same house with her children, remained hidden. The compound itself required enormous resources to sustain. The 3 properties needed constant maintenance. Salt air corroded everything. The lawns required weekly cutting. The docks needed repair. The boats demanded upkeep. The tennis court needed resurfacing. The staff required salaries, benefits, housing. Financial records from the 1930s reveal the scale of this operation. The compound's annual operating costs exceeded $60,000, more than $1 million in today's currency. This didn't include property taxes, which were substantial, or the cost of improvements Joe constantly commissioned. The compound wasn't just a house, it was a small corporation, requiring professional management and endless capital. Joe Kennedy could afford it, but the expense reveals something crucial. The American dream the Kennedys represented wasn't achievable through hard work alone. It required inherited wealth, or the kind of ruthless business acumen that Joe possessed. The gap between the life the Kennedys lived and what was possible for ordinary Americans was a chasm. Yet the myth persisted. The photographs showed a relatable family, children playing, parents watching, summers by, the sea. The machinery that sustained this image remained invisible. By the late 1930s, the first cracks in the family's facade began to show. Kathleen, Kick, fell in love with Billy Hartington, the future Duke of Devonshire. He was Protestant. British aristocracy. Everything Joe and Rose had warned their children against. But Kick was in love, and love made her defiant. When she announced her intention to marry Billy, Rose was devastated. A Protestant marriage meant abandoning the Catholic Church. It meant excommunication. It meant betraying everything Rose held sacred. Joe, ever the pragmatist, saw the political advantage of allying with British nobility. He gave his blessing. Rose refused to attend the wedding. The family's unity, so carefully cultivated, began to fracture. Then there was Rosemary. Her intellectual disabilities had become impossible to hide as she reached adulthood. She functioned at perhaps a 4th grade level. She struggled with mood swings. She sometimes wandered away from caregivers. Joe became obsessed with finding a solution. He consulted with doctors who promised new treatments. Lobotomies, they said, could calm difficult patients, could make them manageable. In 1941, without fully informing Rose, Joe authorized a lobotomy for his 23-year-old daughter. The operation was catastrophic. Rosemary emerged unable to walk or speak coherently. Her personality, what little independence she had possessed, was destroyed. Joe had her institutionalized in Wisconsin, far from the compound, far from the family, far from anyone who might ask questions. The family was instructed never to speak of what had happened. Rosemary simply vanished from the Kennedy story. This was the hidden reality of the compound. It was built on control. Joe controlled the family's image. He controlled his children's futures. He controlled the narrative that America saw. And when something threatened that control, whether it was Kathleen's love or Rosemary's disability, he acted with brutal efficiency. The compound's beauty masked this ruthlessness. The white houses gleamed in the summer sun. The lawns stretched green and perfect. The sailboats lined up in neat formation. But beneath the surface, the family was fragmenting. Jack, watching his older brother prepare for political glory, began to wonder if he would ever escape his role as the spare. Young Joe, feeling the weight of expectations crushing him, pushed himself harder and harder, as if trying to prove he could carry what had been placed on him. The girls learned that their desires mattered less than the family's image, and Rose prayed in her private chapel, asking God to hold together what was beginning to come apart. The compound had become more than a summer home. It had become a laboratory for dynasty building, where Joe Kennedy experimented with his children's lives, treating them as assets to be optimized rather than individuals to be nurtured. Everyone paid a price for admission to this paradise. Some prices would not become clear for years. Others were already being extracted in quiet rooms where the cameras never reached. By 1940, war was spreading across Europe. Young Joe, determined to prove himself, joined the Navy. Jack followed despite his chronic health problems. The brothers were competitive even in this. Joe Sr. watched his carefully laid plans accelerate. Military service would give his sons the credibility they needed for politics. It would prove them. It would prepare them for leadership. The compound, emptier now with the boys overseas, waited for them to return as heroes. But war doesn't care about anyone's plans, and some soldiers never come home. The telegram arrived at the compound on August 13, 1944. Joseph Patrick Kennedy Jr., naval aviator, had been killed in action over the English Channel. His plane, loaded with explosives for a secret mission called Operation Aphrodite, had detonated prematurely. There wasn't enough left of young Joe to send home for burial. He was 29 years old. He had been 2 years away from running for Congress. He had been, in every way that mattered to Joe Kennedy Sr., the future of the family. The compound fell into a silence that felt like suffocation. Joe Sr. locked himself in his room for days. Rose retreated to her chapel and prayed with an intensity that bordered on madness. The surviving children wandered the property in shock, unsure how to process what had happened. Everything Joe had built, every plan, every dream, every carefully orchestrated step toward political dynasty, had revolved around his eldest son. Young Joe was supposed to be president. Young Joe was supposed to validate all the sacrifices, all the pressure, all the ruthless calculations. Now young Joe was ash scattered over the ocean. For weeks, Joe Sr. could barely function. The man who had controlled everything suddenly discovered that some things cannot be controlled. Death doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care about ambition or planning or how much money you have. It simply takes what it wants. The family gathered at the compound that fall, trying to make sense of the loss. The house felt different now. The rooms that had echoed with competitive energy now held only grief. The lawn where the brothers had played football sat empty. The sailboats docked unused. Jack, the second son, suddenly found himself thrust into the role he had never wanted. He became the heir by default. Joe Sr., desperate to salvage his dreams from the wreckage, turned his attention fully to Jack. The presidency was still possible. The dynasty could still rise, but now it would have to be Jack who carried it forward. Jack had watched his older brother struggle under this burden. Now it was his. 4 years later, in 1948, another telegram, another death. Kathleen, Kick, had been killed in a plane crash in France. She was 28. She had been flying with her new lover, a married man, to see her father and try to repair their relationship. The plane hit a storm. Everyone aboard died instantly. Rose, still bitter about Kick's Protestant marriage, refused to attend the funeral in England. The family's fractures deepened. 2 children gone in 4 years. The compound, which had once symbolized infinite possibility, was becoming a monument to loss. But the worst was yet to come. In 1960, Jack won the presidency. Against impossible odds, a Catholic had never been elected president. He captured the nation's imagination. Young, handsome, brilliant. He seemed to embody a new generation of American leadership. His inaugural address spoke of torches being passed to a new generation, of asking what you could do for your country. The compound became the summer White House. Secret Service agents patrolled the beaches. Helicopters landed on the lawn. World leaders called on secure phone lines. The press descended, turning the quiet Cape Cod estate into the center of the political universe. For a moment, Joe Kennedy's dream seemed realized. His son was president. The dynasty was real. But Joe himself could barely appreciate it. In December 1961, he suffered a massive stroke that left him almost entirely paralyzed, unable to speak. The man who had controlled everything could no longer control even his own body. He spent the rest of his life in a wheelchair at the compound, watching events unfold but unable to influence them. His children would have to navigate what came next without him. November 22nd, 1963, a Friday afternoon. The call came to the compound just after 1 p.m. President Kennedy had been shot in Dallas. The family gathered around the television in the main house, watching the news reports with mounting horror. Then the confirmation: John Fitzgerald Kennedy, 35th President of the United States, was dead. He was 46 years old. The compound transformed overnight into something unrecognizable. Secret Service agents swarmed the property. Press vehicles lined Marchant Avenue by the hundreds. Helicopters circled overhead. The family, shattered by grief, tried to mourn privately while the entire world watched. Jackie Kennedy arrived with the children. Caroline was 5. John Jr. was 3. They had just lost their father, and the compound became their refuge from a nation in shock. Rose attended Mass and prayed. Bobby, now thrust into leadership of the family, tried to hold everyone together. Ted, the youngest son, wondered how much more the family could endure. And Joe Sr., trapped in his wheelchair, unable to speak, wept silently as he watched his second son's funeral on television. The dreams Joe had built at the compound, the ambitions he had fed into his children like fuel, were burning, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. 5 years later, June 6, 1968, the compound descended into nightmare again. Robert Kennedy, running for president, was assassinated in Los Angeles, shot in the head at point-blank range just after Rios, winning the California primary. He died 26 hours later. He was 42 years old. The family returned to the compound in a daze. How could this happen twice? How could lightning strike the same family in the same way within 5 years? The compound's rooms filled with mourners again. The same devastating rituals, the same news cameras, the same helicopters overhead, the same unbearable weight of national grief crushing a family that had already been broken. 3 of Joe Kennedy's 4 sons were now dead. The dynasty he had built was collapsing into blood and tragedy. Ted Kennedy, the youngest, survived, but survival came with its own curse. On July 18, 1969, just over a year after Bobby's death, Ted drove his car off a bridge on Chappaquiddick Island. His passenger, Mary Jo Kopechny, drowned. Ted delayed reporting the accident for 10 hours. The details of that night would never be fully explained. Within days, more than 200 journalists descended on the compound. They camped outside the gates. They photographed everyone who entered or left. They demanded answers that Ted couldn't or wouldn't give. The compound, once a sanctuary, became a prison. The press siege lasted weeks. Ted's presidential ambitions, which had seemed inevitable, evaporated. The family's moral standing, already weakened by wealth and privilege, cracked beyond repair. In less than 5 years, the compound had witnessed or absorbed the impact of 3 deaths and 1 scandal that would haunt the family forever. The rooms that Joe Kennedy had filled with children and competition and dreams now held only the ghosts of what had been lost. Joe Sr. died in November 1969, 5 months after Chappaquiddick. He was 81. He had lived long enough to see all his dreams destroyed. The stroke had left him unable to speak, but those who cared for him said his eyes carried unbearable sadness in those final years. The compound that had been built to launch a dynasty had become the place where that dynasty died. Ted Kennedy never became president. The shadow of Chappaquiddick followed him for the rest of his political career. But he did something perhaps more difficult. He endured. For 47 years after his brother's deaths, Ted served in the United States Senate. He became one of the most effective legislators in American history, passing landmark bills on healthcare, education, civil rights, and immigration. He carried the family's political legacy not through executive power, but through the slow, grinding work of legislative achievement. The compound became his refuge. He returned every summer, walking the same beaches where he had played as a child, sailing the same waters where his brothers had taught him to race. The house held too many memories, most of them painful, but he couldn't let it go. It was all he had left of the family that had once seemed invincible. Rose Kennedy lived until 1995. She was 104 years old. She spent her final decades at the compound, attending daily mass, maintaining her routines, outliving almost everyone she had loved. 4 of her 9 children died before her. She never fully recovered from any of those losses, but she also never stopped moving forward, driven by a faith that bordered on stubbornness. In her final years, she would sit on the porch where Joe had once imagined his empire, looking out at the ocean, perhaps wondering what it had all been for. The compound itself became a kind of museum. Tour boats pass by the waterfront, guides pointing out where JFK used to sail. Visitors walk past the property, taking photographs of the white houses and manicured lawns. The Kennedy Library in Boston became the official repository of the family's papers and artifacts, but the compound remained the emotional heart of the story. In 2012, Ted Kennedy's widow and children sold the main house to a group of Kennedy family members who pledged to preserve it. Restoration efforts began, carefully maintaining the mid-century aesthetic while updating the infrastructure. The goal was to keep it as it had been during the 1960s, to freeze it at the moment when the dream seemed most alive before everything fell apart. There's something poignant about this choice. The family could have modernized the compound, turned it into something new. Instead, they chose to preserve it as a memorial, a reminder of who they had been and what they had lost. The compound today stands much as it did in 1960. The 3 white houses, the expansive lawns, the private dock, the sailboats. From the outside, it looks like the photographs that made the Kennedys famous, a picture of American success and vitality. But those who know the history see something else. They see the rooms where presidents mourned. They see the dock where Bobby stood after Jack's assassination, staring at the water for hours. They see the lawn where Caroline and John Jr. played while their father's body was flown back from Dallas. They see the chapel where Rose prayed after each death, asking God why he kept taking her children. The compound isn't just a house. It's a map of American ambition and the price it can demand. It's a reminder that some dreams consume the dreamers, that legacy and loss are sometimes inseparable, that building something to last can require sacrifices that destroy what you're trying to build. Joe Kennedy wanted his children to be extraordinary. He succeeded, but extraordinary lives carry extraordinary risks. The same ambition that drove Jack to the presidency put him in Dallas that November day. The same sense of duty that pushed Bobby into politics put him in that Los Angeles hotel kitchen. The pressure to achieve, to excel, to carry the family's expectations. These forces shaped the Kennedys into leaders, but they also made them targets. The compound witnessed all of it. The births and the deaths, the triumphs and the tragedies, the moments of genuine joy and the long stretches of grief that never fully ended. What remains at Hyannisport today is complicated. It's not quite a memorial and not quite a home. It's not fully preserved and not fully lived in. It exists in a strange liminal space, part museum, part private residence, part tourist attraction, part sacred ground. The Kennedy family still gathers there occasionally. Younger generations who never knew Jack or Bobby or young Joe still sail the same waters, play on the same lawn, walk through the same rooms. They inherit the compound's beauty without fully inheriting its burden. But the house remembers. The staircase Jack struggled to climb with his injured back. The bedroom where Joe Sr. sat in his wheelchair, unable to speak, watching his dreams disintegrate. The chapel where Rose counted rosary beads with fingers that trembled with age and sorrow. The porch where Ted sat on summer evenings, drinking whiskey and wondering if he should have been the one to die instead. These spaces hold memory in ways that transcend historical documentation. They carry the emotional residue of lives lived at the intersection of power and tragedy. The compound teaches us something uncomfortable about the American dream. We want to believe that success is purely heroic, that ambition, hard work, and talent lead inevitably to triumph. The Kennedy story reveals a more complex truth. Success can be a form of exposure. Achievement can make you vulnerable, and sometimes the cost of building something lasting is the destruction of everything you love. Joe Kennedy bought that first house in 1928, believing he could shape destiny. He succeeded in ways that astonished the world. His sons reshaped American politics. His family became synonymous with public service. The dynasty he built influenced the nation for generations. But the price he paid, the price his children paid, was almost unimaginable. 3 sons dead by violence, a daughter lobotomized and hidden away, another daughter killed in a plane crash, grandchildren who grew up without fathers, a family that could never escape the spotlight or the expectations or the knowledge that they were living in the shadow of tragedies that kept multiplying. The compound at Hyannisport stands as evidence of both the dream and its cost. It's beautiful and it's haunted. It represents hope and loss in equal measure. It's a place where America's most famous family tried to build something permanent, only to discover that permanence is an illusion. The houses still stand. The lawn still rolls down to the sea. The sailboats still line up at the dock. but the people who gave this place its meaning are mostly gone now, leaving behind only stories and questions that may never be fully answered. What would have happened if young Joe had survived the war? Would Jack have ever become president? Would Bobby have lived? Would Ted's life have taken a different path? These questions haunt the compound like ghosts, and perhaps that's what the place has become. A ghost story about the American dream, about what we aspire to build and what building it destroys, about legacy and loss, about the truth that some houses are built on sand no matter how permanent they appear. The Kennedy compound endures, but it endures as a warning as much as an inspiration. It reminds us that greatness demands sacrifice, that some dreams are too expensive even for the wealthy, that you can win everything and still lose what matters most. The white houses gleam in the summer sun, the water sparkles, the wind carries the scent of salt and memory. And somewhere in those quiet rooms, the ghosts of America's most ambitious family still whisper their stories to anyone willing to listen. The Kennedy compound reveals how history lives in places, not just in dates and events, but in the rooms where people loved and grieved and tried to make sense of impossible choices. If you found this story compelling, I'd love to know which other legendary estates we should explore next. Rockefeller's Kaikowea, the Vanderbilt mansions, perhaps something more contemporary. Leave your suggestions in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden history behind an American icon, consider subscribing for more stories about the houses that shaped our world. Sometimes the most revealing history is written not in monuments, but in the homes where people actually lived. Thanks for watching.